Hi, welcome to Cafe 229. Today, we're very happy and honored to have Dr. John Dunne. Dr. John Dunne is a distinguished professor of Contemplative Humanities at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Hi, Dr. Dunne.
Hey, good to be here with you.
Thank you so much for joining us at Cafe 229. You are one of the most important scholars and Buddhist teacher at the field of contemplative science because I think you're the great translator between Buddhism and science. How did you get started with this path?
Well, first I should say that, in good Buddhist spirit, it's a little dangerous to be told that you're great at anything because it can make your head swell and, get a little pride going. So
Sure.
I want to be cautious about that. One of the great things about scientific work, which is something that actually recently I'm really trying to bring into the humanities here at the university, is how important teamwork is and collaboration. And there's an old saying, science is a team sport,
Hmm.
which I think is not only obviously true from the publications, because vast majority of publications in the sciences are actually have more than one author, but also the process of science is very collaborative. So I've learned a lot from that kind of collaboration, and I feel that, my contributions in that area have, in some sense, are really the product not just of me, but of myself and my collaborators, and not to mention all my Buddhist teachers and all the lineage of teachers in the
Sure.
traditions that I'm connected to. So, having said all that, I will say that for better or worse, I have become one of the more prominent people in this area. I wish there were more people. That's something we could talk about. But
Sure.
and I do have this really unique chair, this endowed chair that my friend Richie Davidson put together. My friend and colleague here at the University of Wisconsin. He's the founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds, where the chair is located or funded through. And this is a chair in Contemplative Humanities, which is the only one in the world at this point. So hopefully that'll change.
Mhm.
And I think you could say that, part of why is it that there aren't that many people? Why is there only one chair? It is the challenge of kind of crossover work. And I think one of the reasons I was able to do that and is, first of all, that I worked on a particular aspect of Buddhism,
Mhm.
Buddhist philosophy, in my graduate work. On the one hand, that really, and I can say more about that, but basically you can call it kind of Buddhist epistemology about the
Mhm.
nature of perception, concept formation, how the mind works, so to speak,
Mhm.
on the one hand. And then on the other hand, actually having an engagement, a really concrete engagement with actual meditation practices that enabled me to speak about practices not just in an abstract way, but actually in a really concrete way
Mhm.
based on my own experience. Not that I'm a great meditator, but I think it was extremely helpful for me to be able to speak with scientists from the standpoint of someone who actually has at least a little bit of practice experience in various kinds of meditation practices.
Mhm.
So I think the combination of those two things, along with a little bit of a scientific background from when I was an undergraduate, that enabled me to kind of start in this area. But the thing that really got me going was actually a very concrete collaboration with Richie Davidson, whom I
Sure.
just mentioned, this neuroscientist.
Sure.
So that was back in 1999, 2000, when that first started.
He's one of the most well-known scholar in the field of mindfulness and contemplative science. And I know part of the reason why people pay attention to his work is because meditation and mindfulness become so popular. I have been watching this field grow. I started in 20 years ago. Back then, it wasn't as popular as now. So,
Oh yeah, it was nothing like now. And in fact, you can look if you go on anything like, there are these databases like Scopus and Web of Science where you can enter a term in and see how many publications there are over the years. You can get like a little chart. And if you do that, you'll see that prior to 2000 on mindfulness, there's basically it's down at zero. And then the curve just slopes up, almost it's incredible to see how quickly the
yeah,
number of publications accelerated. So we went from zero to more than 1,000
yeah,
publications in peer-reviewed journals a year, which that are in some way connecting with mindfulness in their abstract. So
mhm,
that says a lot, and that was due to these Richie really played, and I guess Richie and all of us, collaborating together, other scientists like my friend Antoine Lutz, when we all kind of connected way back then when we were working on this ADEPT study. And actually, the way I got pulled in was one of my undergraduate students wanted to work on mental health and meditation and Tibetan Buddhism, and she kind of almost literally dragged me into Richie's office because I'd never met Richie before, even though we were on campus together. And we just immediately kind of hit it off as friends, discovered that we knew a lot of people in common, but also that he needed very concretely. Initially, it was just he needed someone who could translate because he was bringing in practitioners who did not speak English. They only spoke Tibetan.
Okay.
So it sort of started out as, the way I got into it was really just translating. Like I need a translator. But then over time, it became more than just translating, the language. It became translating the concepts, translating the practices, the models of the practices. And then, on the basis of that, also then starting to do independent work that kind of blends what we get from the Buddhist traditions along with the sciences to do what we call transdisciplinary research, which is in some way trying to move beyond both of those.
Makes sense. So would you say like part of the general interest of mindfulness nowadays is really like meditation practice? It seems like that's one of the attractive area for people who pay more attention to Buddhism.
Yeah, I mean, so mindfulness it's been, there's a little bit, sometimes mindfulness has become so popular that with a lot of things that become very popular, there can be a kind of backlash. So we also talk about, I don't know if you've heard this term, but the mindfulness backlash.
Yeah.
And I think some of the critiques that we see coming, up in that backlash are good to hear because there is a way in which mindfulness got to the point of becoming so widespread that people were thinking that it would just fix everything, and it'll give you not just help you deal with stress, but it'll help you deal with your sex life, or make you make more money in business, or make you a more powerful person or a successful person, or whatever it is. And so there are ways in which mindfulness, of course, can help across the board because mindfulness is working with the mind in a very basic way. But the kind of idea that it was just, almost like a pill that will fix everything for you, that was really a problem. And then there are other things about the ways one can practice mindfulness that can, in a way, lead to, let's say, a kind of complacency about life. It can enable one to, instead of really trying to transform oneself, it can enable one to just get stuck in a rut and then be not maybe happy in that rut, but not unhappy enough to change things.
Yeah.
So that's actually a very important thing about mindfulness. But really where it took off was, starting with this work that John Kabat-Zinn, my friend, and his colleagues at the UMass Medical School, back in the late 70s, when he was working at the chronic pain clinic there, they developed, mindfulness-based stress reduction. And John came out with the book Full Catastrophe Living in 1990. And that was the basis for the first study that was done here at the University of Wisconsin before even I was working with Richie Davidson.
Wow.
That was a very basic study about the immune response to actually flu vaccine from a comparison between a control group and then a group that did mindfulness-based stress reduction that John himself taught, actually, the 8-week course. He came here every week and taught. And what was important about that study is that it did demonstrate it was one of the few really it was actually, I think you have to say, the first very carefully controlled study. Certainly, one can point to various types of issues, like it wasn't in what we call an active control. But nevertheless, it was one of the very first carefully designed studies that showed a true impact of mindfulness. And I think what we find is that, part of the reason it became so popular is that, both the scientific research and then just, word of mouth, so to speak, people found like, mindfulness can really have an impact. But, and that's true to a very great extent. But one of the problems is when we say that, we're talking about large aggregate numbers, we're talking about statistical responses. And when you get down into the weeds, into the details, sometimes the story gets a lot more complex. And part of the
Yeah.
complexity of that story is actually mindfulness itself, which is a single word, but it's really not a single thing, as it turns out.
Yeah, I mean, the definition of mindfulness is so complicated, it could get really furry, I mean, different Buddhist tradition have different way of explaining it. And even the concept meditation itself, people may have different ideas about it. So I found that when I'm teaching my students, the very first lesson when I'm teaching mindfulness and Buddhism is just to explain what is meditation, what is mindfulness. How would you explain that to the beginners?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and because actually, and you're just before you said, like, well, think of mindfulness as meditation, and there's definitely a way of practicing meditation that's going to produce or enhance mindfulness. But actually, mindfulness is also just a kind of fundamental feature of the mind that is not about meditation per se. It's something that we can train, that we can cultivate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a key aspect of the Buddhist tradition, right? Which is that actually we can get better, so to speak. We can become enlightened, but we can also just get better than we are now. We can suffer less, we can become more compassionate.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we do that? We don't actually have to necessarily kind of find qualities that we're going to generate all from the beginning. In other words, we don't have to create something new in the mind. We actually work with most of Buddhist practices are working with innate capacities that we already have
Mm-hmm.
that we can enhance. So meditation is really, it's a very broad term. And in Sanskrit, so a lot of when I think about this stuff, I often go back to the original Sanskrit texts.
Mm-hmm.
And in Sanskrit, the term for meditation is bhavana, which really just means making something come to happen, causing something to come into being.
Mm-hmm.
Or even you can say like enhancing something. Uh, so it doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what meditation is. And when the Tibetans translated it, interestingly, they translated it with a term gom that has to do with habituation, like getting used to something or becoming familiar with something
Mm-hmm.
or habituating yourself to something. But that also is not a really great explanation. So, in a sense, you could say what meditation is for across the board in a very general way in Buddhist practices is that there are many, many different kinds of meditations, but all of them are forms of mental training,
Mm-hmm.
basically. Sometimes those forms of mental training include physical trainings. There are actually meditative practices, especially in the tantric traditions,
Mm-hmm.
where you use physical movements and physical techniques in order to induce mental changes,
Mm-hmm.
but they're still targeting the mind. So you can think of meditation training in general as a form of intensive mental training,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then the question is, well, what do we want to train? So depending on what we're trying to work with, there are many different kinds of meditation. All of them, to some extent, involve this kind of intensive, you might even call it repetition, could be a term here that would be important. And that's where the Tibetan term gom, as a sense of habituating yourself to something.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is a sense in which you're going to go back and do the same thing again and again and again and again
Mm-hmm.
and again. Like any form of training, like
Mm-hmm.
rehearsal, if
Okay.
you're learning to play the violin, you need to do it again and again and again and again. So there is a sense in which there is this kind of, repetitive there's a kind of technique. Sometimes the technique is to have no technique, by the way, which is a very interesting kind of practice.
Sure.
The practice of not practicing, which is very interesting. Maybe we can talk about that at some point.
Sure. The Chan
But
approach.
so there are many different ways of techniques because there are many different kinds of targets. So just to give you one example, many styles of meditation involve actually focusing the mind on a particular object.
Mm-hmm.
And that object could be something like a physical sensation. It could be something like a mental event, like even a mental sound, like a mantra. It could be a sound that you're vocalizing with your mouth.
Mm-hmm.
or it can be something you visualize, or it could even be like a visual object. It could be an external, like an icon of a Buddha, or even just a pebble. So there are many different ways and many different kinds of objects. But let's say that I'm having trouble with lust. So one of the practices that would be done then is I would actually sometimes literally go to a cemetery. And classic in ancient India, there were types of cemetery practices where the corpse was just left out.
Yeah.
And I would just go and observe each day the progressive decay of a corpse. And then also at a certain point, instead of doing that, actually going to a cemetery, I can just do that visually, and rather through visualization, I can just do that mentally.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to do here is develop what's called Ashubha Bhavana. The Bhavana, that's that term, again, term for meditation. And on meditation on what? On something that is ugly or unpleasing, Ashubha.
Yeah.
Why am I doing that? Because I'm having too much trouble with desire. So that would be a very simple example of a practice that has a specific target, and that would be done for certain kinds of people who have certain types of goals. But another practice that's actually very commonly known is what's called metta practice in Pali, or maitri in Sanskrit. That's loving kindness practice.
Yeah.
And that practice was actually originally developed for people who were experiencing fear. Especially fear while they're trying to do their other meditation practices. Maybe they're in a wilderness area. I believe that actually the original story that is said to be the source of this is that there was a practitioner in a wilderness area who was feeling quite concerned about sort of wild animals and whether he was safe in that area. And the Buddha gave him this practice of loving kindness in order to make him feel safe. So that, in a sense, all of the dangerous animals around him, instead of being afraid of them, he had loving kindness for them, and that then kind of brought him a sense of safety. That practitioner. So there are many different kinds of practices, and mindfulness practices are just one of many. But you can say that mindfulness as a kind of set of mental features is something that's pretty much involved in every kind of meditation.
So it's one of the mental capacity that is involved in different kind of meditative practice or mental training in general.
Yes.
Right.
That's right. So, people who know kind of what I refer to as contemporary mindfulness, the style of mindfulness that Jon Kabat-Zinn helped develop, was a leader in. And John's, the way he described this, I think it was in 1994, he created what he called an operational definition of mindfulness. An operational definition, by the way, doesn't tell you the characteristics of a thing. It just tells you, in a sense, it describes it in a way that would actually enables you to produce it. So the operational definition of a peanut butter sandwich is take 2 pieces of bread, put peanut butter on one, and put the other one on top of it. So that's the operational definition of a peanut butter sandwich. So the operational definition of mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. So many people are familiar with that definition, and we can circle back to talk about that.
Right.
But that's not a you won't find exactly that way of talking about mindfulness in Buddhist texts, not quite exactly like that.
Yeah.
Very much inspired by Buddhist texts, but it's not. You won't find that exactly. What you will find is that when people are talking about mindfulness as what's called the cetasika, which means in Sanskrit, that means basically a mental capacity that across the many different kinds of Buddhist philosophy, the kind of philosophy here we're talking about is called the Abhidharma, kind of Buddhist psychology. And there are many different, texts and different traditions of Buddhist psychology that go back some 2,000 years or more.
Yeah.
But really interestingly, across all of them, this fundamental capacity that's called smrti in Sanskrit, or sati in Pali, and this is the word that was translated starting in the 19th century as mindfulness, as a description of a mental capacity. And that word can be used in many different ways. But as a description of a mental capacity, it just means that which prevents distraction. That's it.
That was it.
It's the only thing. That's all it means.
Uh-huh.
Like, how do we define this term, so-called mindfulness, this capacity? It means that if I am focusing on an object, then I'm not going to experience what's called attention capture
Hmm.
by some other object. Meaning, I'm trying to focus on my breath, let's say. I'm
Yeah.
doing, a breath style of meditation. And I start to think about, I don't know, my to-do list, or what are we having for dinner? I start to think about other things.
Right.
That's attention capture. That's where
Hmm.
my attention has. I'm trying to place my attention on that object,
Hmm.
but then something else captures my attention. So mindfulness is what prevents that attention capture. That's
Hmm.
it. Actually, it's only like the key core aspect of mindfulness as a mental capacity is just that,
Hmm.
which is interesting because that can apply to basically all forms of meditation, even meditations without an object,
Hmm.
actually. So
Neat stuff.
that's fascinating. But it doesn't tell you like how focused are you, actually. It just tells you that your mind is not being pulled away.
Hmm.
But it doesn't really tell you how clear your mind is, right? It doesn't tell you how whether I'm kind of sustaining in some sense some kind of a target or goal that I'm trying to work on.
Hmm.
Am I holding in mind other and some kind of a model of the purpose of my practice or of my vows or anything like that?
Hmm.
It doesn't tell you about those things. And that's why when we talk about mindfulness as a meditation practice, we usually also talk about two other features, which is
Hmm.
samprajanya in Sanskrit. That means basically, the best translation is meta awareness.
Okay.
And then the other term is apramada, which is many people translate as heedfulness.
Hmm.
But a kind of cognitive sciencey translation may be a little contentious. Some people might not like it, but would be task set retention,
Okay. Okay.
where you have a task, you
Hold
have
on
like a
to it.
task, and
Yeah.
you're retaining that task.
Hmm.
That could be a quite complex task.
Uh-huh.
It could be a task that has multiple goals included in it, but that the ability to kind of retain that task set. So if let's say I'm doing, again, breath meditation, I need something that keeps my mind from going to another object. So that's the
Hmm.
mindfulness capacity.
Right.
Then meta awareness is what's going to be monitoring, seeing whether it's going to know when I leave the object, if I lose it,
Hmm.
how do I know that I've lost it? Well, that's the role, one of the purposes of meta awareness.
Hmm.
And then the whole, like, keeping in mind, what am I supposed to be doing right now?
Hmm.
That's the task set retention or
I see.
heedfulness. So those three kind of combine together. And they really, you could say, in all meditation practices, and maybe even theoretically, not just in Buddhism, like if we talk about meditation practice, that maybe that all three of those are always involved.
Hmm. In even non-Buddhist meditation, they do have some of those
Yeah,
qualities, right? But so I think in general, when we think of meditation, as you mentioned earlier, is a way to train the mind. But it's like martial arts. There are so many different martial arts, but you can
exactly.
categorize them into like several major categories. So one major category is I guess, is to train our mind to focus, to be able to sustain our attention to a certain object, sort of the stillness, the shamatha practice. And I guess other type of a Buddhist meditation is to train or to enhance your meta awareness, right? The insight aspect. So can you say a little bit more about, I mean, I'm thinking one of your famous paper right now, talk about how there are different aspect of meditation, the cube paper, right? We could sort of
Oh,
think about
yes. Yeah.
there are different aspects of our mind we could train on. So can you say a little bit about the importance of insight? Because I think a lot of meditation could train your mind to be focused, but there's something about insight that make the Buddhist approach a little bit different than other people.
Yeah. One of the issues with scientific study of meditation practices for quite a long time. I mean, the scientific study of meditation practices, it goes all the way back to the 1950s, in fact. And some of the earliest studies some of them were actually on Zen meditators.
Yeah.
And there were also some studies on meditators from Hindu traditions. Uh, But even back then, and as meditation studies started to accelerate, just about 25 years ago, starting around the year 2000 or so, right, with Richie's work, many people, just because I suppose of a certain kind of a habit that had been established in the scientific community, did not specify what kind of meditation they were studying. They would just say, this is a paper about meditation. I don't know, this is a paper about sports. Like, well, which sport? We studied the effects of sports, and that would be sort of absurd, right? To say that,
Right.
because obviously, curling on ice is one sport where you take a broom, and that's a very different sport than running a marathon. So
Right.
the effects of those different activities are going to be very different. So too with many different meditation practices. So finally, starting with with Richie, and then another one of my main collaborators has been Antoine Lutz. He's now in Lyon, in France, and running a lab in Lyon. And we and Helene Slachter worked on a paper with another collaborator from the Netherlands. We worked on a paper that has become very highly cited. It's one of the highest cited meditation papers that tried to at least give people a very basic way of talking about different styles of meditation, similar to what you were just saying. And so we coined these terms: focused attention and open monitoring. So focused attention styles, and the idea here is that these terms don't correspond to any Sanskrit terms. They're not like translations. Rather, they're kind of umbrella terms for many different styles of practice. And not all styles of practice would necessarily fit into these two categories, but many, many different styles do. And a focused attention practice, as you said, is one that you're really trying to cultivate the capacity for one-pointed attention on an object in a completely undistracted way. An open monitoring style of meditation is a style of meditation that is where the target is not really focus on an object. You may use focus on an object, but that kind of focus will generally be less intense, because the goal is actually to cultivate, instead of that focus, is to cultivate a kind of broader awareness. Again, this term meta-awareness, which is a little bit like, some people say it's awareness of awareness itself. It's okay as a description. Maybe we should try to unpack it further. But I'll just say we have these two styles, like open monitoring and focused attention. In an open monitoring style of practice and a focused attention style of practice very often kind of converge, because there are many traditions in which you start with focused attention. I start by really focusing my mind on an object. And then I gradually learn how to attend to kind of the background of my experience. Even while I'm still focused on the object, I'm trying to pay attention, in a sense, to open up my attention to much more than just the object. And eventually I may even drop the object. So while I'm focusing on the object, I need to be aware, am I distracted? So that awareness of distraction is what we call meta-awareness. And it can, according to some theoretical models in the Buddhist world, the way you do that is you actually check, am I distracted? So I kind of look inward and say, I'm focusing on an object, then I kind of say, oh, am I distracted? If I do that, then what happens is I lose this object for a moment while I check inward. Right? So another way of talking about meta-awareness is while I'm on the object, I'm sort of aware. I'm monitoring my awareness even while I'm still focused on the object. And hypothetically, and more than hypothetically, we see this empirically, is that, we have access to a lot of information that is not about the object we're focusing on. And we have access to that information all the time. It's included in our memories of experiences, for example, or our capacity to respond to an experience. So our body position, for example, is something that's included, that we have that just as our part of our experience. If I say to you, we've been talking for a while, and I'd make a sound like that, and I say, were you sitting down when you heard the sound? And do you
And people
say
will
like,
say, yes.
yeah, do you say, oh, I don't know. I wasn't paying attention to my body position. Make the sound again, and then I'll quickly look at my body position after you make the sound. Rather, like the experience of hearing includes a sense of being embodied. So
Mhm.
meta awareness is like a very broad term that's giving us a sense of all that other information that we're aware of. And that thing includes things like our emotions, our body position, our location in space, even the sense of presence of other people in the room, for example. Those are all sort of bundled inside this term meta awareness.
Mhm.
So kinds of practices that cultivate that can be very important therapeutically because it seems that people have deficits in meta awareness that correlates with various types of challenges in terms of psychological
Hmm.
issues. But also hypothetically, it's very important, or more than hypothetically, it's actually very important for certain Buddhist traditions
Mhm.
that emphasize what's called non-dual awareness.
Ah, so since you talk about non-dual awareness, now this is the real interesting part because different Buddhist tradition have a different, I guess, approach to that meta awareness, right? For example, for certain traditional mindfulness approach, you kind of have to know whether your mental object is wholesome or unwholesome. But in the, let's say, the Zen approach or Tibetan approach, you have to suspend even that judgment and to approach in a non-dualistic way. So can you
Yes,
go
that's
into
right.
that a little bit more? Because I think that's related
Yeah,
to my question of insight, right?
yes. Oh, right. I'm sorry. Insight. I kind of lost track there. Uh, yeah. So, right. So, one of the ways of thinking about what's the purpose of meditation? You can have many different things. It can be dealing with fear. It can be dealing with desire and so on. But of course, the final purpose for Buddhist traditions is always to gain insight into the nature of reality
Mhm.
because it's what we call prajna in Sanskrit, wisdom.
Mm.
That's what eliminates the confusion that causes our suffering. So if our goal is to eliminate our suffering and the suffering of others, we have to have that kind of insight.
Mhm.
And one way to think about what meditation practices are doing is they're doing many different kinds of things, but certain practices are focused specifically on cultivating that kind of insight. And that insight, again, is into the nature of reality itself. And to a very great extent, one way to think about what we mean by reality is that reality is what's presented to us in consciousness. So understanding the nature of consciousness is, for some Buddhist traditions, is actually that's what it means to understand the nature of reality.
Mhm.
But certainly for all Buddhist traditions, understanding the nature of consciousness is a key aspect of understanding the nature of reality.
Mhm.
So insight just into the nature of our experience itself. What does it mean to be having experience? How do experiences happen? How do I get stuck on something? What's the nature of thinking as opposed to perceiving?
Mhm.
The nature, like what's the difference between seeing an apple or biting into an apple and thinking about eating an apple? What's the difference between those two? So those are kinds of questions, that inquiry about the nature of experience that many meditation styles are inviting us to
Mhm.
have a look into. But all of the traditions will say, yes, in the end, we need an insight into the nature of reality, but then they'll disagree about exactly what is really reality. And some traditions will say that, what we have to do is really focus on kind of the constituents of our mind body system, the constituents of our world, and see what is the exact nature of these things, and specifically to see that they are impermanent, for
Mhm.
example.
Sure.
To see that all the causal stuff we're working with is always impermanent. There's nothing that is permanent at all. That also, none of them constitute some kind of an unchanging fixed identity. That since everything is constantly in flux, you
Mhm.
can't say, well, if I have some sense of I or me, that's also going to be in flux. Even
Right.
if I think there's some kind of true unchanging identity inside of me, the claim will be, well, if I really look for it, I won't find that.
Mhm.
Right. And then also that our ordinary experience is even the pleasant experiences are kind of caught up in a process, a sort of merry-go-round that always brings us back to suffering. Because we're confused about, for example, the idea that things are actually always changing, we sort of don't want to accept that.
Mm-hmm.
And also that we don't have a fixed absolute identity. And because of that confusion, even when we're trying to do things that don't make us happy, it doesn't work out well because we're
Right.
confused about who we are, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So that style of practice is very important, and you'll find that in many different traditions, especially in, for example, in the modern day Theravada tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are some other traditions that said basically that that's good. We want to investigate, the kind of fundamental building blocks of our reality, of our minds, of our bodies, of our world. But there's something that's actually even subtler as that's kind of obscuring our experience of the true nature of reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the structure of what we call subject-object duality.
Mm-hmm.
The claim is that the sense of there being some kind of a knower, the one who's seeing, the one who's knowing, the one who's hearing,
Mm-hmm.
that there's some kind of an entity inside and there's a world outside, and that these are completely distinct, different things, that itself is also a kind of fundamental confusion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it'd take a long time for us to maybe go through arguments and describe exactly why that's, how do we get there? That would have to be another interview, I'm afraid. But
Sure, I would love to get into all that. but I think
but
one key thing though is doesn't matter which school of practice you're in. It seems like a good theoretical understanding of your own school is quite important, right? If I'm from the non-dual, maybe Nagarjuna's teaching is quite important for me to have some basic understanding about it.
yes, definitely. There's one of the processes that's sort of developing wisdom. There's said to be three kinds of wisdom: the wisdom from learning, the wisdom from contemplating, and the wisdom from meditation. And the first two are all about study, basically. They're about learning,
Mm-hmm.
learning what are the philosophical positions, what are the different accounts of how the mind works, and then really thinking about them, contemplating them until one gets a sort of aha sense of, oh, now I get it. And then meditating on that,
Yeah.
meditating in that kind of a state. That is, that process. So the end point is a kind of meditation doesn't need to use concepts and thoughts anymore, but you can only get there by first using those concepts and thoughts and those various theoretical models. That's
Mm-hmm.
really important, even in the non-dual traditions.
Right.
But as you were saying, in the non-dual traditions, right, there is a sense in which you have to suspend ethical judgment during your meditation. And part of the reason for that is the non-dual traditions are trying to basically induce a state of awareness in which one is fully aware without a sense of being a subject knowing an object.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that we need to kind of move away from everything that gets us caught in that dualistic structure.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the key things that gets us caught in that dualistic structure is basically our judgments, especially our moral judgments.
Mm-hmm.
Because in some sense, our sense of what's right and wrong is very deeply ingrained into our sense of our own identities, actually.
Yeah.
So if I'm, figuring stuff out in the world, that's this is good, this is bad, this is a thing to be done, this is something not to be done. I'm automatically in a dualistic modality.
That's right.
So if I'm going to try to move back from that dualistic modality, do a kind of practice, for example, in which maybe I start with an object, but I eventually just drop the object and simply try to rest in that open awareness, then I need to let go of those judgments, because those judgments are just going to push me right back into a dualistic state of mind. And that's why when we see in Jon Kabat-Zinn's formulation, remember, his operational definition, paying attention in a particular way, which is to say on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. And when he says non-judgmentally, that's actually what he's referring to, because his base, the source of his, of his inspiration for that form of mindfulness is actually Zen, especially Korean Seon, or Korean Zen.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I remember that. So it's actually, would you say that the therapeutic or the contemporary mindfulness is more in accordance to the non-dual tradition in some sense?
Yeah, so this is I've had the pleasure to get to know John pretty well over the years, and we've had a number of conversations about this, and he's also written some stuff. And basically, John has, I think in 2011, for example, wrote something in which he really clarified that the foundation is Zen. The some of the technique actually is from Vipassana in the Theravada tradition, and then there's Tibetan non-dual Dzogchen sprinkled on top. It's how he put it. So, it's a non-dual sandwich, right? It's got like Tibetan non-duality and Zen non-duality, but in between, it's got what is usually thought of as a dualistic practice in its kind of classical forms, which is the Vipassana practice.
Uh-huh.
That certainly has some non-dual aspects too, but
Sure.
the sort of dominant forms are dualistic, in at least these days. And so that's confusing for people, and because but for John that worked well, and I think you could see that there are definitely Tibetan non-dual traditions that in a way kind of do the same thing,
Yeah.
combining dualistic
Yeah.
approaches with the non-dual. So the short answer is yes. It's contemporary mindfulness, sort of therapeutic mindfulness, is definitely mostly inspired by the non-dual styles, which means that the kind of meditative state they're looking for is more of that open monitoring, which again could be a place you might start by focusing on an object, then you gradually sort of let go and just remain in that undistracted state. So why is it mindful? It's called the mindfulness of mere non-distraction in one of the Tibetan traditions, Mayan Sanghi Jamba. And why is that mindful? Because I'm not distracted. I'm not my mind is not being pulled away by objects, but I'm not focusing on any objects either.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's why that's a kind of non-dual style of mindfulness.
Yeah, in my own tradition, we do have this sense of because mindfulness can be explained as to be in the present without conflict or opposition, and you have to be non-dual to be in that state of mind, which I want to bring to, I guess, the remaining time we have left. I want to bring it to compassion, because how does non-dual awareness help us to cultivate compassion, especially nowadays in the mindfulness science? There's like self-compassion, there's compassion. Like, what is the relationship between mindfulness and compassion?
Well, that's a really important question, a great question. I have written something fairly recently, I guess it was 2023, it came out, on compassion and self-compassion with my graduate student, Jeremy Mannheim. Compassion is not necessarily connected to mindfulness in any direct way, strictly speaking.
Right.
But then when we say, especially if we just think of mindfulness as a mental capacity that inhibits distraction, that stops distraction, an interesting debate occurs in the early Buddhist texts between one style, one kind of Abhidharma, Buddhist psychology, that says mindfulness therefore can occur even in negative mental states. I can be really like a sniper can have mindfulness.
Sure.
And probably does, actually, according to that tradition. And then there would be, in the Theravada Abhidhamma, the dominant interpretation there is actually, no, mindfulness is always virtuous. You can't have it in a non-virtuous state. And that's just a very interesting debate. So if we just think of mindfulness, so like a sniper can have mindfulness, even though the Theravada tradition would say no, it does seem quite plausible to say that that fundamental capacity to not be distracted is something that anyone can have, even when they're engaged in negative activities or negative mental states. So just as a description of a kind of mental capacity, mindfulness doesn't seem to at all connect to any particular kind of emotional style. Possibly because we say in general, again, this is shared by all of the different forms of Buddhist psychology, if one is in what we call a klesha, a negative mental state or a destructive mental state, it's always disturbing. It always causes a disturbed mind state. It can feel good, like I can have, I can be in a kind of addictive state,
Hmm.
and enjoying whatever I'm addicted to, but it's still disturbing. It's hard for me to have a very focused mind. So, you know, probably if I have strong negative emotional states, then there's no way for me to really have mindfulness. But there's not a direct connection, you could say. However, when we talk about practice, there is a very direct connection. Because if we think of a key aspect of mindfulness style of practices are about becoming familiar with and gaining insight into the nature of our own experience, then if I am averse to my own experience, if I have what's in Sanskrit called dvesha, right? A kind of aversion or even like dislike of my own experience, my own internal experience. I don't want to face certain emotions. I don't want to admit to myself that I feel a particular way.
Hmm.
Then I'm not going to be able to do that kind of inquiry into the nature of my own experience.
Right.
So in Pali, the term adoso, which means advesha in Sanskrit, it basically means being non-averse. And that's sometimes in some commentarial traditions will then interpret that as being actually not just non-averse, but actually having a kind of friendly, loving attitude, even towards your own experience.
Hmm.
Because again, if I'm not, if I'm averse to it, I'm just going to push it away. I'm not going to be able to look at it.
Right.
In the non-dual world, compassion becomes much more intrinsically linked with the practice.
Hmm.
And there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them is actually that compassion can be a key way of facilitating non-dual experience.
Hmm.
Because part of what compassion does is compassion, and here compassion is always defined as oriented toward another person.
Hmm.
Or at a subtler level, it can be compassion that's oriented toward, a more sophisticated account of what a person is, not just a naive sense of there's, just a person there, but rather that there's a complex, psychophysical process that we call a person
Hmm.
going on. But I can have compassion for that whole process, right? So when I do that, I'm in a sense pulled out of myself. And very strong feelings of compassion make it such that I am, in a way, the whole kind of self-other distinction begins to collapse.
Hmm.
And so that sense of kind of thinning out the distinction between self and other, a sense of my concern for other being even stronger than concern for self, the kind of feeling that parents have with their children, for example,
Yeah.
that lovers have for each other, that sort of incredibly intense sort of compassion actually, in a way, already induces a type of non-dual awareness or something
Right.
that's close to non-dual awareness.
Hmm.
So then it becomes a sort of bridge into that non-dual awareness.
Hmm.
And then non-dual awareness itself, by its nature, because, what is it that prevents us from being compassionate toward others? There are a lot of things. But one of the things is just a sense in which, well, your suffering doesn't matter to me. Like, it doesn't matter if you're experiencing suffering because, I don't know, maybe you're my enemy or,
Hmm.
maybe you're just someone I don't know. And like, I don't care enough about you to care about your suffering. And my own situation is, I'm too concerned about my own situation to even think about yours.
Yeah.
So those kinds of attitudes actually are highly dualistic because they have a very strong self-other distinction.
Hmm.
If, on the other hand, non-dual experiences, non-dual states of awareness, and we see this also when they are induced, at least partially, by psychedelics, for example, which is another area of research I'm involved in. People emerge out of those types of experiences, whether it's meditative or otherwise,
Hmm.
with a sense often of much greater compassion because they are no longer, they realize that kind of distinction, the strong distinction between self and other,
Hmm.
is a false distinction.
Hmm.
So the non-dual awareness itself becomes a kind of compassion on the one hand becomes a way of facilitating non-dual awareness,
Hmm.
and non-dual awareness itself becomes a way of facilitating compassion.
Yeah.
So that's one way of thinking about, the relationship between, especially non-dual styles,
Mhm.
and compassion.
Yeah, I think from my tradition, like compassion and wisdom are inseparable, like light and the lamp in some way. And I think one of the way we learn about compassion, the greatest compassion, is really non-dual. There's no helper. There's no the person being
Yes,
helped, and there's no act of helping, right? So all
that's
three
right.
are empty in some way.
That's
Um,
right. So, there's, and yes, so definitely wisdom and compassion are completely inseparable. I think probably for all the Mahayana traditions, there's a
yeah,
complete
yeah.
inseparability of wisdom and compassion. They're completely integrated because, in a sense, they're nothing just but consciousness itself, the nature of consciousness itself.
Mhm.
But also that sense of that sense of, how do you put it? You could even say that the knowingness capacity is a kind of compassion. The mere capacity to know, to be conscious, is itself a kind of connectivity.
Mhm.
It's a kind of dynamic connectivity. So just that aspect of consciousness itself is already, in a sense, the sort of seed of
Yeah,
compassion.
yeah.
But then, in another way, we could also say that compassion and wisdom for most of us are more separate, but they still can feed into each other,
Mhm.
right? That
Yeah.
that some little taste, a little bit of a non-dual experience can help us be more compassionate, being more compassionate to help us to induce more of that
Mhm.
non-dual experience. But even setting aside non-dual, just being, in a sense, more attentive and less averse to our own experience,
Mhm.
right? And that other way we were talking
Yeah,
can help us to be more attentive and less averse to other people's
that's right.
experiences as well.
Mhm.
And then maybe we reach the point, like there's three kinds of compassion. Compassion for people, like I just have compassion for you as a person. Then there's compassion, that's the lowest, simplest form.
Mhm.
Then a subtler form is I have compassion for the complex psychophysical process that we can call you,
Mhm.
right? But there's actually a very complex process there. And then we can have compassion that's called, annalambana karuna, compassion without an object at all. And that's what you were talking about, that
Yeah.
compassion that, in a sense, there is compassion from the standpoint of emptiness,
Mhm.
whether we can't define the compassion in terms of self, other, or process.
Such a wonderful conversation with you, and I think I could just keep going on with you for another 3 hours, but I don't think people would have time for another 3 hours. What would be your sort of take-home message for our audience about our conversation today?
Well, we covered a lot of ground. So I think that one of the most, for me, the key aspect of this is this really engaging with the idea that we already have these fundamental capacities, including compassion,
Mhm.
including meta awareness, including mindfulness,
Yeah.
and that our role, it's not like we have to go out and find them somewhere, or buy them off a shelf. We
Mhm.
already have them, and it's just a matter of us learning how to cultivate them more fully and
Mhm.
to be confident that that's possible, that like we really can do it. We can change, we can
Mhm.
transform ourselves, we can become better people.
I think it's a great reminder that the treasure are within us. We don't need to seek outside for it.
Yes, exactly.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Don. It's a
Th-
wonderful conversation with you. I really thank you for coming to Cafe 2 tonight.
Thank you.
And I hope you enjoy our conversation. And you should check out Dr. Don's work. We will put some of his work on our website. So every month, third Friday, 7 p.m., stay tuned.